If I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Liane Schalatek. Okay, so from the Heinrich Boell Foundation. That's right, yes? Liane, if you could explain to me we're talking about vast sums of money involved, some pledged, some has actually arrived, some hasn't arrived, but it's not an easy measure. It's proving to be very difficult to spend the money in the way it should be spent to deal with the effects of climate change. What are some of those obstacles?
Well, I want to start out a little bit back, because as you mentioned correctly, a lot of the money has been pledged. It has not been paid into the various funds, and it has not been disbursed to the extent that necessary. And I think one of the big issues, and that's actually some of the work that we've done, is focusing on some of the norms and criteria that are necessary to make sure that the money, once it arrives, really is spent in a way that is both equitable, that is effective and efficient. And I want to throw in the equity part, because we feel, particularly as you're talking about public climate finance, that's a very important component. You want to make sure that the money that is pledged and is delivered eventually, particularly if it's taxpayers' money, is benefiting those people and those countries within the globe, the larger global context, that are suffering currently from climate change the most, and usually have the least possibility to have their voices heard in the global process, like here in Cancun.
So to some degree, you have to do a public relations exercise to let us, the taxpayer, know that our money is being well spent.
I think that's very much part of it. And actually, I think the basic overarching principles of transparency and accountability, which I would say are really core democratic principles, are what's at play here. Because the taxpayer, the German taxpayer, the American taxpayer, but also either the taxpayer, or to the extent that taxes are not paid, the citizen of Malawi have a right to find out what is happening with funds that are dedicated to climate financing, particularly if they are spent by an industrialized country with the express purpose to either mitigate or adapt to climate change. And then in the recipient country, if Malawi accepts those funds for that express purpose, will any of that really go to the citizen of Malawi that needs it most? Some of the people in the rural areas, some indigenous groups, women particularly, who are often not considered in those climate financing instruments.
Does it make it difficult to plan when you get pledges, huge pledges from developed countries, which then don't arrive?
This is actually one of the biggest problems. I think that particularly with respect to adaptation, a lot of the poorest developing countries are facing. This is one of the principles that we highlight as one of the core principles for the generation of climate change funding in our study, which is really predictability. How can you start a process, either a nation institution building process within a recipient country nation? How can you start even a project that you want to have longer term? And we know that a lot of the adaptation related projects really need a longer term time frame. You won't be able to fit it in a nice little project description of a 2 to 3 year project line if you're talking about adjusting rural agriculture to the fact that you have less rain, or adjusting emergency response system in villages in Bangladesh to the fact that all of a sudden you have a lot more rain and a lot more unpredictable flooding. So all of those processes take time. The unpredictability of funding really allows only for a project by project approach, and most of those projects are very short term. It doesn't allow really for the sector planning, the programmatic approaches that we need if you really want to make sure that you're not just responding short term to a crisis situation, but that you're really going to that low carbon, climate resilient development path that we are obviously all hoping for.
Is there anything specifically that you're hoping for from this conference that will make the disbursement of funds easier for you?
Well, the disbursement of funding, I think there are a couple of things that actually would help. One is actually a strong reaffirmment of at least the minimum political pledge for long-term climate financing that was made 1 year ago in Copenhagen. The now infamous 100 billion per year by 2020, even though we all know that it's not going to be enough money. Another one is basically a reconfirmation that at least half of that will go to adaptation funding, so that not all of it is spent in some of those high-tech, projects, large-scale projects, mostly in emerging countries, but that the poorest developing countries are getting their fair share by focusing on adaptation financing. And then with respect to the disbursement of funding, I think there it's really going to make a difference what kind of global climate fund should a decision be made here in Cancun on going forward with such a global climate fund we are going to see. Is it under the UN Framework Convention? Who is going to be the trustee? What kind of model of climate funds, basically governance structure do we want? Do we want it similar to the structures that you have now for climate funds that are under the World Bank? Or do you want to follow the model that you have with the Adaptation Fund? If you have a model like the Adaptation Fund, for example, you allow countries and subnational groups within countries direct access. That means they don't have to go through a multilateral development agency, which incidentally skims off quite a substantial amount of that funding as their secretariat or agency fee, and it can be up to 10% of a project. And if you're looking, for example, at a 5 billion project, again, Malawi, Burkina Faso, and any other of the poor countries, having 500,000 taking out for project management through an implementing agency is a huge chunk that probably could be delivered much cheaper if you do it via some of the existing national channels, or where you don't have national channels, by continued financing allow for the building up of national institutions that can take on the task. And I think ultimately we have to be very conscious that particularly adaptation funding has to involve a large part of capacity building, institution building in developing countries if we really want to make sure that should those 100 billion that we are all hoping for, and we are hoping for more actually arriving long term, that they are spent effective, again efficient, and in a way that is equitable.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.